about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's be free with Now looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Hello, good evening. I'm Duncan. This is Ciara. I always get that wrong. They're pointing in which direction. And it's lovely that lots of you are joining us this evening to discuss your politics paper tomorrow. I notice in the chat window some of you are discussing other things as well, but we're going to be focusing on your politics paper tomorrow. I'm just going to just banning someone. Sorry, there we go. Because I've got the power. Lots of people saying 1,000th live stream. Is this what Tutu's 1,000th live stream or your 1,000th live stream? If I've missed a important milestone, I do apologise. So we are going to be looking at paper 1. Yes, the live stream will be starting shortly, Patrick. It's starting right now. And we are answering your questions tonight, and we are going to basically see what your issues are about paper 1. Oh, Jeff said it was the 1,000th. All right, brilliant. Fantastic. There we go, a landmark. And we're going to I'm seeing questions coming through already. Quite a lot about minor parties and number and sort of two-party system and things like that. One thing I will say just before we start, that's quite an interesting question, but we're first of all, we're not in the business of making predictions of what might come up. If you look over the questions, and we have at GTD, we've got the topic tracker where you can see what topics have come up in different years. There are, you can see things that haven't been looked at yet or haven't been looked at for quite a long time. But at the same time, you can also see when you look at that how often they do actually assess topics within the following year, or the same area. That would be a different question, but look at the same sort of area of the spec quite again. So just because something was asked last year doesn't necessarily mean it won't be asked again in a different way, and don't necessarily assume that just because something hasn't been asked yet it definitely will come up. But lots of people getting some predictions in there. As I say, we're not in the prediction game. It will be politics, yes. Yeah, it will be politics, Rufus, yeah. But we're not, beyond that, we're not going to predict. But so lots of questions coming in. What we thought we might start with is looking at some content things for UK politics and also structure type issues. And then we'll move on to ideologies. I know that quite a few questions are coming in about ideologies as well. I'm not ignoring them. I'm sticking favourite on them so I can revisit them. I know they'll disappear in the thread, but I will be able to find them. Just one other thing quickly. Oh gosh, lots of them are talking about it. Okay, just little thoughts before we get going. First of all, I'm really glad you're joining us tonight, and do some revision this evening, but also make sure you do chill out a bit, get a good night's sleep. Don't my dog, you can see my dog in the background. Don't spend all night revising and things. You know about it. You know about this stuff. Okay. But with that said, let's go and find a few of your questions and let's start having a think about it. So quite a few of you have asked about significance of minor parties, and also is the UK a two-party system. This is obviously something that someone at some point somewhere has suggested as a predicted question type or whatever. It is, we're not in the business. It hasn't particularly been asked before, and I suppose there's two kind of ways they could go about it. Are we a two-party system or a multi-party system, or how significant are minor parties? What would be our points, Ciara? What do you reckon if we were working on this essay? Putting you on the spot there.
Yeah, like you said. Yeah, no, it's okay. So like you said, they're not, it's difficult to predict the questions, but sometimes absolutely. You can think, and when they're making the questions, it tends to somewhat echo what was happening around the time that the papers were made. So there is a chance that minor parties could come up in that sense, but we don't know. But I think if I was to think about this, if you had a question like evaluate the view that the only parties that matter are the two main parties, which is something we've had similar, it'll be the wording won't be as clear as evaluate the significance of minor parties maybe. And you would have to think, well, what are they significant for? So break it down and think, okay, maybe they're significant because you can show a shift in voting behaviour, and you could write a paragraph about that and what that reveals about that. Or you could go down maybe the road of this idea that we're breaking away from the two-party system and people are dissatisfied with voting and choosing between Labour and Conservative, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see that shift in voting behaviour, can't you? In the last election's a good one to use. Can compare that with, say, 2017 and 2019, where it was much more polarised between, most people voted Labour or Conservative, and now last election much more spread out. You could do, as a kind of point, well, they're not significant because they don't form the government, and then you could say, however, that's not always the case, is it? Because in devolution, they often do, and we've had coalition governments and confidence and supply type governments, so you could do that sort of angle, and then you can look at their influence, I suppose. Not in government, but their influence on policy. Brexit is the big one, isn't it? UKIP had a big impact on Brexit. Reform are having an impact today. Would Keir Starmer have made his speech last week about immigration if it hadn't been for how Reform had performed in the local elections? He says he would, but I'm not convinced. So he says
it in the speech, right? He says this has nothing to do with everything. Like, well, okay, by saying it seems like you're admitting it.
Yeah. So that influence of minor parties is very clear. So, I mean, we've come up with more than three there. So you pick the ones you got the most to say about, the ones that you can pair the arguments, and of course you need to have a nice, clear judgment that you can justify. What do you so? You can have a think about it in the chat window if you like. What do you think? Do you think it would be a? Do you think it would be? Would you answer that they are significant or not? Okay. So yeah, someone said, can you talk about the coalition? You could talk about the coalition, although as you said, but in the Examiner's report points out the Liberal Democrats are a major party or one of the established parties. That's true. So it does depend on it depends a little bit on what the question was. If you were asking the question, are the two main, are Labour and Conservative the only parties that matter, then you can obviously say, well, actually, no, the Liberal Democrats matter too. If you were asked, if it used the phrase minor parties, you don't want to describe the Liberal Democrats as a minor party necessarily, but a third party. Similarly, if you're asked about a two-party system, then obviously Lib Dems are a third or fourth party that you could talk about there. Sorry, that was I, I. There's lots of other ones coming through, so I'm just wanting to talk about this. Okay. Oh, people are saying about the phrase "the third party." Yes, that does mean you could talk about that.
Keanu's made a good point here as well. He says we've lost it now. Minor parties are significant, moving the political centre to the right, influence politics and devolved assembly, and a lot,
sorry.
and also sometimes needed for a majority. So that's a good point in how you can talk about the coalition, but then kind of erring towards caution there is the fact that they did put them down as a major party. But it's a really good point.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful summary.
Yeah, well done. I'll just pop that up there. I didn't mean to type Keanu into the chat window. Then I was typing into the search bar and typed it in the wrong place. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so there's lots you could talk about there. You could also mention voting systems, couldn't you? First past the post essentially leads to a two-party system. It suggests a two-party system. First past the post doesn't cope well with votes split across many parties, as we saw in 2024 with a massively overrepresented winner. The winner's bonus happened on a much bigger scale than it normally would because of that split in the votes. And then, of course, when you talk about devolution and things, you can say, well, in Scotland and Wales, and particularly Northern Ireland, the different voting systems help those smaller parties and give them more representation. Yeah, is that okay? Right, I'm just trying to work out what we're going to do. Oh, there's loads of. Could you say that reform split the vote as them all right-wing the Conservatives? Oh, I've lost that one now.
That's a good point.
Conservatives, therefore, it could be argued that Labour won due to reform taking votes from Conservative. Yeah, absolutely. That was you absolutely could make that point. Yeah, and obviously in the past that's tended to happen the other way with Labour and Liberal Democrats kind of dividing, and if you go back to 83, Labour and the SDP helping the Conservatives. So yes, if there's multiple parties ploughing similar political territory, shall we say, or going for similar votes, then that often helps another party to do well. Yeah, good points. Okay, so we had a couple on that about sort of two-party systems and things like that, but hopefully that we've covered that really. Another one that people have been asking about, and I'm guessing again, been having a look at the topic tracker, seeing to what extent this has come up, is a rights in context type question. So yeah, rights does come into paper 1, and it's largely linked with pressure groups, isn't it? It's kind of yeah.
Previously it was about to what extent and then just roughly paraphrasing, but to what extent have pressure groups had more impact on rights than government legislation, or something to that effect.
It was something like that, wasn't it? Yeah. And it was comparing it with legislation, and so that would be kind of Human Rights Act and Equality Act and things like that, which obviously we talk about in component 2 as well. This is one of those areas where there's a little bit of crossover when it comes to rights, and you need to avoid going into a full component 2 mode and doing an essay all about the Supreme Court and stuff. So you do want to focus on more your component 1 side of things, but you're bound to end up talking a bit about that in there. So yeah, what would a question look like? It could be that. It could be to what extent, what extent does do pressure groups secure the rights of people in the UK as British citizens, or evaluate the view that you know, the citizens in the UK have rights are well protected or well secured, or something like that.
Yeah, because it does
Yeah.
tend to be more associated with pressure groups,
Yeah.
and party legislation, like you said,
Yeah,
because Supreme Court is a component to
that's definitely a
aspect of it.
component too. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like the powers and things,
Yeah.
whereas this would be more so about how kind of citizens have been able to uphold their rights,
Yeah, and
protect their rights.
secret redress, and particularly, things like Liberty or Amnesty International and those sorts of groups, and how they manage to advocate for people, or if they do, if they've been successful in doing that or not, and more recent cases as well. I could see it being quite a nice source question potentially. You might have a source
Yeah.
about pressure groups being effective or not in securing rights. Maybe that's where I could potentially see it coming up, but obviously again, not in the prediction
Yeah.
game. Just seeing if we've got any comments on that before I go on to.
So if it says evaluate the view, so Maston, if it says evaluate the view that rights are protected in the UK, could you do one paragraph on pressure groups and one on government and one on Supreme Court? I mean, that's a really good question, and that kind of links what someone was asking about essay structure, which I think we'll go into more later. I mean, you could do that, and then as long as in each paragraph, and so your criteria is each of those features.
Yeah.
Supreme Court might be a bit messier because it's not actually in that part of the spec.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if. Ooh, I guess you could do it at the first
Yeah.
two, and then compare the extent to which that they are.
Yeah.
But I don't
Yeah.
know if you'd have a question that
No,
close.
it probably would have something in the question that steered it away from your component 2 stuff and more into the component 1. It's one about individual and collective rights. Don't want to freak anyone out with the possibility of that being a question, but any what we always say is anything on the spec could come up as any type of question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is an interesting one.
It is an interesting one. The other thing to bear in mind with some of the stuff that's in there is that it, particularly some of the stuff with rights, actually, although it's not restricted. My point isn't restricted to that. Is that actually sometimes they're more likely to come up as a comparative question on paper 3 if you do the US UK, if you do the US, and they might ask about the difference between the way rights are protected in the US versus the UK, or the role of interest groups in relation to rights in between the two and stuff. So I know that's not what we're talking about today, but that's another area where that content could potentially come in. I'm sorry, I'm just making sure I'm not missing important things. Oh, here's the one. Just while I'm looking for other ones, let's just pop that one up. Is it all right not to completely remember statistics and figures from each election? Go on, Ciara, what do you think about that while I while I find some others? Okay.
So it can be, obviously knowing statistics from core elections can be helpful. So if you want to think about one that shows low voter participation, if you want to show one where you had a massive swing towards one party away from another, it can be helpful to kind of have those set ones in mind. But I would say whichever ones that you're remembering, think about why you're remembering them. It's not just about having statistics for every single election. It's only about the ones that are going to be useful for your arguments, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's some key things it's worth having to hand, isn't it? Like the turnout in 2024 would be a good one because it was very low. It was basically 60%, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah. And again, approximate, near enough is going to be but the point is you want the point. Are you going to make that really strong argument? But yeah, if you've learned a couple of election case studies, if like say for example that someone was really overrepresented, and that's a point you might want to make, or underrepresented. Say if you did 2015 and how many what percentage of the vote UKIP got, or sort of compared with how many seats they got. That kind of thing could be really useful. But you don't, you would never need to like list how much everyone got and how many, all the details. It's what makes a point. It's what would
and I think as well, like the examiner is going to understand that you're somebody who's sitting and writing this in time conditions. So if you make a mistake, let's say you're a percentage out or something like that, the examiner is told just to ignore the mistake. So even if you're not sure, just put one down. You can't,
if you think,
lose in that sense.
It's positively marked. So obviously you won't be credited for wrong information, but you won't have it, you won't have it taken away. And remember, it's marked holistically as well. So one little mistake in amongst everything you've written is going to have very little impact on the marks. So take a risk. If you think you remember something right, go for it.
And someone mentioned
you probably have remembered it right, or you'll be really close.
Probably. And someone mentioned here, like going back to 2024, it's like, well, Keir Starmer got 34% of the vote then, and then you can say, how far is that a democratic system? That could be an example of how people might not be fairly represented in the UK, or why we might need a new voting system. It's just about how you use that information.
Okay, different topic altogether, because this one's a few people have asked about this now, so I'll just get it. I'll put this one up first, but a couple of people have asked about it in slightly different ways. Can they ask about extending the franchise? It's never come up before. Yes, they can, because they can ask about anything that's on the spec. It's unlikely to be about the past developments, unless it could come into like a source or something, about the suffragettes or something. But about extending the franchise in the future, absolutely. So 16 and 17-year-olds getting the vote, quite a bit in the news about that just recently. Obviously it wasn't in the King's speech, despite being in Labour's manifesto. There's whisperings at the moment that maybe it's being dropped, despite only last month Keir Starmer saying they were absolutely committed to it. That's always a sign that they're probably going to drop something. I'm sorry, I've got to be careful on these. I'm sorry, but there's, I think, one of the more right-wing newspapers was reporting yesterday, I think, that it was going to be dropped because they thought that 16 and 17-year-olds would vote reform. I don't know whether that was the reason. That's the reason, really. But that was, I think it was the Express for reporting that. So take that with a pinch of salt, perhaps. But they could ask about that and other things, other sort of reforms to elections that could come up, like compulsory voting, or who else might they give the vote to? Prisoners, electronic voting. So extending the franchise could come up. The obvious way would be giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote. That would be the sort of not easiest, but the clearest sort of way they could ask about it.
It could come up as a source question. I think it has in the past, or in some sample material.
Maybe on a specimen paper or something like that.
Specimens, not the actual exam.
Yeah, I can't mention that. E-democracy. So more use of computers, 16, 17-year-olds voting, prisoners voting. So that stuff could come up, and you're right, it hasn't come up before in an actual live exam, as far as my quick reading of the topic tracker before we came on is right. But that's not to say they will ask it, but it is a potential thing they could ask about, and it isn't too bad, actually. It isn't too bad. The arguments around giving 16-year-olds the vote, there's quite a clear debate to be had about that. You can look at what happened in the Scottish independence referendum, where the turnout was higher for 16-year-olds, but subsequent elections in Scotland, it has sort of normalised. They're not voting in as high numbers as they were in the referendum. Other countries do it. Norway's an example that you can throw in. There was quite a lot of support for it, and governments just won an election with it in their manifesto, but whether they actually do it, or all of that sort of stuff. Why might you not? Young voters generally have very low turnout, so they might do too. Some people say they might be easily manipulated by populists and extremists, although whether that's more true of 16-year-olds than any other age group, I don't know. But that's a potential argument, isn't it? Maybe some of the issues in the election won't particularly affect them, but all of these have nice natural counter arguments. Like, they do, or or whatever. So it's not a bad one to get, is it really? I think that'll be okay.
And I think Karma also said, is debates over suffrage similar to extension of the franchise? Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like, should the franchise be extended? And I think, a lot of that kind of the historic elements of it is kind of partially to do with political reasons. When the spec was introduced,
To
it
add
was during
more.
a conservative government. They felt the curriculum wasn't British enough, so there were a lot of reforms in those years. And I think it's kind of there partly to appease that, but also to set context. So it's useful to know that suffrage or extending the franchise isn't a finished business. And I think that's maybe more where that sits. So not looking back and including that, but arguments that it's not a finished business.
Yeah, someone else, is compulsory voting a part of extending the franchise? It's not so much extending the franchise, but reforms to elections, things that could be changed in elections. Yeah, so, and obviously you've got that the example of, say, Australia, where that is a thing. They have higher turnout than us. They also have quite a lot of people voting for reopen the nominations or none of the above, and so that But yeah, there's stuff you could talk about there as well. Just a quick one, and this is not me telling people off in the chat window at all, but I am keeping an eye out on the comments. If you don't sort of just keep sending the same comment over and over again, because that might be it's not going to make me more inclined to put it on the screen. Let's put it that way. Okay, so 16 to 17-year-old age group in the Scottish referendum in 2011 got 75% turnout, which is more than the 18 to 24-year-old age who got 58% turnout. Excellent, good knowledge, and that is absolutely right. So that's a good little factoid you could include to illustrate the point that maybe 16 and 17-year-olds should get the vote despite young people normally not having a high turnout. Maybe they would. Okay. Right, there's lots and lots coming in. Some of them are about ideologies, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just get a couple more for UK politics first. What about pluralism versus elitism debate for pressure groups? My class reckon that may come up. Whether your class may or may not be right, it always could be. That it sort of comes into a broader discussion of whether pressure groups are a positive feature of our democracy, aren't they? Do they perform, a positive role as a pluralistic organisations where there's lots of different voices, competing voices, and that's a good thing for a pluralist democracy? Or do the rich and better connected, powerful groups dominate? So yeah, it could come into a question. What do you think, Ciara? Is that anything to add to that?
I think so. It comes into it. Like, you never, unless it's a source question, you won't get a question that's super narrow. So that could be like a criteria against pressure groups being good for democracy, that they actually encourage elitism, and you could talk about funding and the lack of transparency and things like that. So I think it's a good kind of argument to look at, as a good paired argument, actually. Do they encourage pluralism, or is it for narrow interest groups and things like that? But also think about other aspects of pressure groups and their impact on democracy. So yeah, they make change, and that's good, because it means that we have more participation and things like that. But kind of linking back to elitism, actually, who are they making the kind of change for? Or actually, so that we don't overlap, you could say that the government's elected, or MPs are elected, and are they undermining the work of elected officials as a counter?
Yeah. Okay. There's one here. Actually, this I think this was on last year's paper, wasn't it? Or something very similar to it. I think it was one of the source questions on last year's paper. Can you evaluate the view that UK's major parties have abandoned their roots? It wasn't worded quite like that, but have no longer have their historic principles or something along those lines. It's not too. One of the only main issues with that one last time actually was people ignoring the poor old Liberal Democrats. That was the main issue that people had when it came up as a source question. I think one thing to avoid is turning it totally into an ideas question. Yeah, you would bring in a little bit about what are the main principles of conservatism, perhaps, that the Conservatives may or may not have abandoned, and socialism and liberalism. But it's not to what extent is socialism united or whatever. It's a different question, and you want to be mainly talking about political parties and political party content. which does involve a little bit about their ideas and ideology. That does come into political parties as well, but don't sort of turn it into an ideas question. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that could be the risk of it. And I think, you know, the context of this being in a paper one could be more so about political parties and their division. And I think that's the thing that's interesting about the two major parties and maybe the third, I don't know. But the fact that they're fragmenting, aren't they? You've got the mixture of kind of old Labour and new Labour in the Labour Party, and One Nation Tories, and more modern Tories or liberal, I don't know actually, right-wing Tories on the other side, or neoconservative. No, they're not even that, are they?
No, I mean, it's quite interesting what is the current sort of, what type of conservatism is Kemi Badenoch? I don't know. You answer in the chat window if you've got an idea. Not that you'd ask that for ideologies, but you could bring it into political parties. Okay. Along similar lines, well, not quite, but one of the main differences between the Labour and Conservative parties today, we're not going to spend too long on it, but it is sort of thing that could come up in terms of policy and political parties. It was sort of quite a while ago, there was a question, I can't remember if it was this spec, about the differences within parties are greater than the differences between them, or something like that. It was obviously a pre Jeremy Corbyn question, sort of a kind of a question of the sort of catch-all centre party type era. And when you look at least to the Labour Party, you kind of feel like we're returning to that sort of catch-all type, or at least attempted catch-all type approach, and competing for the centre ground. But it has to be said, the Conservatives aren't really doing that at the moment. So I think you could still say there were some quite big differences, but it's just what are they? If you start looking on policy points, it's less clear. Today gave us one, attitudes towards the EU, so that would be one that we could use, because obviously Keir Starmer did his renegotiation with the EU today, and Kemi Badenoch's very unhappy about the decisions about the fishing in particular. So that would be one area you could do. But some of the other areas, actually, they're not that different, are they? On what they're saying about immigration, about Ukraine, about Gaza, about a lot of issues. They're not that different, but there are certain things. Public ownership of the railways, new employment rights legislation. So there is stuff you could find. But yeah, so you want stuff on both sides. That's always the thing with these questions, isn't it? If you spot any that I should be doing, Ciara, let me know, and I can sort of,
and I think that's also important in terms of like the issues of the two-party system, because they become so similar that people have less choice. That undermines participation. Is that why it was so low in the 2024 election? So I think it's just, with each of these topics, each of these questions, just always think about how it fits into the bigger idea of what you've studied. And that's what I really like about A-level politics, actually. It is very holistic. And it means something. It's not just facts to learn, but it's like, what does this mean in relation to the wider things that I've studied?
Yeah, so that sort of converging of parties saying similar things not only might explain a rise in reform, but also the Greens and lots of people voting independent at the last election, or not voting at all. Yeah, absolutely. Can we discuss media and arguments for and against its influence on elections? I'm going to hand that to you, Ciara, for a little minute while I just double check I'm not missing any ones. What do you think? For and against?
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. You can think about it in terms of like, what are you defining as media as well? So obviously with more recent elections, we're seeing the impact of social media and how much that's kind of swaying elections. Like 2019, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives held back a lot of their campaign money until the last few weeks of the election, where they put loads of things out on social media, which they could use to target specific demographics. So that's quite interesting about how that's kind of changed it. And then, of course, you've got the fact, though, that despite all of that, print media is still seen as the main decisive factor in elections. And that's because mostly older people read print media still. And older people are still kind of swaying the vote because proportionally they are the biggest part of the UK's population. which again could link to the need for younger people voting. Like it could fit kind of anywhere. So yeah, kind of thinking about the extent to which media has an impact on elections, and I still think it does have a significant impact, particularly print media.
Yeah. Okay. I think we'll just do maybe one or two more for this, and then we'll move on to ideas. Sorry, there have been a few on electoral systems, and I was going to click on one of those, and I accidentally switched it off instead of adding it. But there've been a few about electoral systems. Obviously, we've had a couple along those lines before, and that's no reason to assume that you won't get it again.
There's a good point here about what do you do tomorrow to prepare.
Oh yes, I did see that one. Yeah, go on.
I think just you, like Duncan said at the beginning, you worked on this for 2 years, maybe not hard for the whole 2 years, but I would say
I'm sure they did.
Yeah, I'm sure. But hopefully in the last month or so, you've maybe said, oh, okay, actually I have an exam in this, and taken it a bit more seriously. And I think kind of between now and then, I would not kind of look at content so much, but look at past papers, look at just the structure of exam questions, and just not like planning them is great, but you don't have much time. So maybe just kind of thinking, oh yes, I would include this and that for that. Oh, I really don't know anything about this. Let me just read it super quick. So, or like kind of like you guys have been saying different topics, and we were just saying, well, actually this could fit into a question about this, and this. So
making links is always a good thing.
Yeah, and link it to that, and just think about it. Don't stress too much.
Yeah,
rest is important.
Yeah, and spend a little bit of time just reminding yourself about the kind of skills as well as the content. Just think, oh yeah, I do need to indicate my judgment straight away, and have these kind of debates within my essay, and have a nice flow of my judgment throughout. Because remember, 10 marks out of the 30 are for this what you know stuff, and you can get a lot of credit for doing the structure stuff well, and showing those other skills. So, it's very easy when you get into the election for all that to sort of go out your head. Sort of the exam. I've got elections on the brain. It's very easy when you go in the exam for all that to go out your head, and just to sort of throw facts at the at the paper. But do just sort of keep in mind, you want to do the structure right as well.
And I think even like with the structure, and the only way you can have a good structure is if you think about the answer before you write it. So I would recommend just winding down this evening, not doing too much. I mean, that's what I would do if I was sitting the paper. But then I say that as a teacher, I don't know. I think as a student, I did that as well, actually. And just when you're in the exam, like just take a moment before you answer each question. Have a look, see which ones you like, and then like think about it for a few minutes before you even start putting your pen to paper to plan. That's the only way you'll get a good structure, because you've thought the argument through. It's not, like Duncan said, it's not about what you know, like knowing loads of random facts. It's about how you structure those facts and make it into a coherent argument.
Yeah. Read the question a couple of times, make sure it's asking what it is asking, not what you think it might be asking, what you hope it's asking. If there's anything that feels like a curveball and like, oh my god, why are they asking that? They will be asking about stuff so just again take that little bit of time to think, well, what are they actually asking here? They're not going to randomly be asking about stuff that wasn't in the spec or that I haven't learned about. So this is a debate that I know about. They've just worded the question differently. Just give yourself that minute just to think, what actually is it? Lots of people now are been asking lots of things about the ideology stuff. So we're going to move on to ideologies now, and so for the rest of the time, ideas and maybe a couple more things on structure. Okay, hopefully we've covered a nice breadth of the content stuff. Is it likely for there to be two socialism questions? Now, again, we're never in the prediction point of view, but there has been this talk since the very start, hasn't there? That they do not rule out the possibility. They do not rule out the possibility that they could ask two questions from the same ideology, whether it would be socialism or a different one. They've never done it. And the reason for them saying that they might do it is so that you don't not revise, so that well, it's not even not revise it, so you don't not learn. Or 3, they don't want a situation where you could say, oh, well, let's just not do socialism because there'd always be another option. So that's why the risk of it has been said there. I'm never going to say it's not going to happen because Edexcel have said it could, but it hasn't. I think that's as much as we can say, isn't it, on that? I don't think we can sort of say, and again, I wouldn't try and predict which ideology is going to come up in terms of which 2, if there are 2, which 2 there'd be. There wasn't a socialism question last year, but that doesn't mean that there'll definitely be 1, let alone 2 this year. There could be, but they've not always made sure that there's 1 comes every other year or anything like that. I mean, you can't quite do that with 3 anyway. So, it'll be what it'll be. At least you got some choice. Pick the one that you like. In terms of what you might get for socialism, we had the last one that came up, which a couple of years ago, was about was one that students struggled with a bit, which was like the extent to which the third way had abandoned socialist principles, and the problem with that was trying to talk about all the strands. Because it was very easy to just talk about the third way, or like just do third way versus revolutionary or something like that, and poor old Social Democrats got left out of the party. Just be cautious with the question. Make sure you talk about the main strands, the main named strands. Lead with them, illustrate with the thinkers, and to the extent, focus on the extent of agreement or disagreement. Obviously, make sure you're answering the precise question that's been answered, but that's what you'll do to answer it.
Yeah, and I think that's what kind of many students made a mistake with. It's like the question is always, in essence, to what extent is there agreement or disagreement within the ideology? But sometimes it is phrased in ways like that, which immediately, because it's so different to what you've seen in class, people panic, right? And like Duncan said at the beginning, it's just like, you just have to read the question carefully. It's like decoding it. What is it it's saying? Like, you've probably discussed that question in class, because there's only so many ways that it can be asked. So many questions that can be asked. So it's just about working out like what it is that is being asked before you answer it.
Obviously, they try and avoid repeating the exact same wording again, and so sometimes they will be worded in a slightly different way. Found it more with the non-core ones. You find that because they have to come up with 2 questions every time for that one, you find themselves repeating themselves quite quickly. So finding a different way of asking for the same sort of content, so just you do know the stuff they're asking. They just might be wording it in a slightly different way.
And that, in essence, is the most important thing. Just make sure that in your answers you've covered each of the strands, and basically just talked about how they agree or disagree on each, the extent to which they agree or disagree. Because remember, just like with the other questions, you need to have argument and counter argument. You can't just kind of go one way with the answer.
Okay. And the only different, there's one about this, there is a structure question about this, and I'm going to be a little bit equivocal on the on this structure, because I know there are sort of 2 main structures doing the rounds from teachers, and both can get there. Both can get the high marks. So I'm not going to recommend one over the other. But just before we get to that one, can you help with conservative key thinkers? I'm trying to figure out who the One Nation thinkers are. So one thing about key thinkers generally is that they don't perfectly fit into the strands. Okay, some of your non-core ones, this happens quite noticeably with. We've got a couple, at least one in socialism. Like, which strand do you fit them in with? With the conservatives, they probably fit better than the others. A bit clearer than the others. But it's really clear who the traditional is. It's clear who the new right ones are. Although they're both neoliberals, and it's a bit annoying that we don't really have a neocon in there. We don't have a perfect One Nation thinker. I mean, Michael Oakeshott, I think, is sort of often used as a bit of a One Nation thinker, isn't he? I mean, a lot of what he said is quite similar to traditional type ideas, but then he is a 20th century thinker, and he was quite moderate, which is a kind of One Nation type thing. And in some of what he says is a little bit new rightish, you know, in terms of like on sort of in terms of the economy. So Michael Oakeshott's just a conservative, doesn't, and you can sort of use him to make, you can use him to make points across the others. If you're trying to make a sort of classic one nation point, like the classic, what is the point of one nationism? You know, that under sort of free market capitalism, everything's a bit too divided, and so there's, you might need to, that whole the cottages. Oh, if the cottages, I can't remember what's this phrase. What's the one? The palace is happy if the cottages. No, I'll find it for you. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get to is it's Benjamin Disraeli who said that. No, he's not one of your key thinkers, but he's the person probably most associated with one nationism. So, and you can borrow him and mention him if you want to, but you don't have to.
The strands are the main focus of the essay, right? So it's about comparing the strands. The thinkers are examples that help to exemplify the thoughts on those strands. So the exam board requires you to use at least 2 key thinkers. So technically, once you've put those 2 key thinkers in, you've achieved what you need to achieve, right? That's not saying only do 2, but that's just the parameters of the exam. So within that, it means that it is perfectly reasonable to use Disraeli as a one nation thinker, so long as you have actually included your other 2 main thinkers as well. Because I think it is bizarre that he's not there, because he fits, right? And that's the same with all of the ideologies. You can use other key thinkers. Just make sure that you're not doing that at the expense of including 2 key thinkers.
Yeah. So the palace is not happy the palace is not safe when the cottage is not happy. Oh, someone else, Amelia's done it as well. Well, thank you. Thanks, Amelia. You got there straight on time, same as Jinx. Okay, we've got it at the same time. Yeah, so that's the idea that, you need to look after the poorer in order to avoid problems. Lots of people talking about, can you use Ed Davey in a liberalism essay? I probably wouldn't. No, I'm not saying Ed Davey isn't a thinker. That would be rude. But he's I don't. The ideas questions aren't asked for Edexcel, and this is an Edexcel session. Make that clear. Aren't asking you about contemporary party politics. There's be the odd bit of part because. When you talk about the third way, you're bound to talk a little bit about New Labour. If you talk about New Right, you might mention Thatcher or whatever. But it's not about party politics. It is about the ideas. So if you sort of got into a sort of, is Ed Davey modern liberal? Well, yeah, he is. So that. What else would you say about that? It's not really. That doesn't really answer the question. A question that you will be asked.
The case for him's not been made yet. I would leave it. For him to give him a chance, maybe in 20 years, I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably
okay.
There was a good point actually, and it kind of links to this a little bit. Is like, I think Mariah said it, that if you got a society question and panicked, can you use a human nature essay plan? Now, I wouldn't use a human nature essay plan, and I just be careful with the idea of rehearsing essays and things. Yeah. But you could include human nature when talking about society, because the conservative, liberal, or whichever ideology it is, their view on society is informed or influenced by their perspective on human nature, if that makes sense. So just because the question says society doesn't mean you can't talk about human nature. I think most of the essays that I would write on this would include the ideology's perspective on human nature, because that underpins every kind of aspect of that ideology.
Yeah. And they do all link, don't they? Like, if you've got a question about the state, you're going to talk about the economy, because you're going to talk about the extent to which the state should intervene in the economy or not. And so, they're not separate silos of knowledge. So, yes, if you've prepared, if you've got more to say about the economy and the questions about the state, don't answer the question as if it was an economy one, but use what you know to answer the question. Absolutely. I've just God,
There was
some,
another one here about books. Can we include books
yeah,
written by
I
thinkers?
spotted the same one. Yeah, absolutely. If you know them. So what I don't want to do the night before the exam is panic anybody that doesn't know any, because you'll get credit for knowing them, but you won't. You can get a good mark with it. You can get top band without knowing. But it's a good way of showing some key thinker knowledge if you do know. But on its own, that's just knowledge, isn't it? It's did John Rawls say something in that helps answer the question? If you just like say, I know a lot about these key thinkers and what they wrote, you're not going to get marks on that. But if you can use it to answer the question, brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah,
I always think
and
it's quite handy.
quotes can be good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
If
if you know them, that's a good point. Like, because you explain the quote. Yeah.
Don't panic about quotes now, but yeah, if you've got a couple, great. One that always comes up is the Hobbes about the nasty brutish and short one, isn't it? But if you've got a couple, workers of the world unite, you've got nothing to lose but your chains. That's always a good one, isn't it, for Marx? Yeah, it's nice to have a quote or two, and yeah, if you can say, as Burke wrote in Reflections on the Revolution in France, or great. Hobbes wrote in the Leviathan, but don't panic if they're not tripping off the tongue on the night before the exam. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Okay. The classic: is Beatrice Webb an evolutionary socialist or a social democrat? I'd say she was a democratic socialist, but that's no use to you either. So she is an evolutionary socialist. She was a Fabian, but when we talk about our strands, the strands that they are wanting you to focus on are revolutionary socialism, social democracy, and the third way. Beatrice Webb isn't really any of those three things. The one she is closest to is a social democrat. But what's the important thing is, if you're using Beatrice Webb, you use it to illustrate a point. It doesn't have to be. She doesn't have to sit perfectly in the strand that you're talking about at the time. So, for example, if there was one about the extent to which socialists agree about how to change society, which wouldn't be the nicest question in the world, but it could come up, couldn't it? Which is basically a revolution versus reform type question. Then Beatrice Webb's great there, and you'd probably use her to make a sort of social democrat point, even though she would have described herself as a socialist. But that said, Anthony Crossland and Tony Blair describe themselves as socialists as well, and obviously they're all under socialism, and they describe themselves as democratic socialists too. So it's these things, how people self-define and how we might use them is a slightly different thing. The reason why people would say she's an evolutionary socialist or a democratic socialist is the idea that she wanted ultimately to get rid of capitalism and replace it with an economic system known as socialism, whereas Anthony Crossland kind of thought we were already in what he thought of as socialism by the 1940s. So a mixed economy with was socialism enough for Anthony Crossland. So the difference between them isn't as vast as it might seem, in terms of what they both believed that you could reform your way to a better society, and that a Labour government coming in and bringing in socialist reforms was what you wanted, rather than you didn't need to have a big revolutionary upheaval. So you can use them in that way. Yeah. So use them to make the point that you're wanting to make. Yeah.
Yeah, and try not to attach them religiously to the strands, like, because it can be more confusing. And just think not about like what you've rehearsed, but like actually just engage with the question and think about how I would answer that. Not what am I supposed to be writing, if that makes sense. Although there is something to pull up from. I don't know if you can see Artie's comment about fundamentalist, revisionist, and third way.
RT. Oh right, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. It's just it's a
Um,
little thing to bring up, and it's not anything to worry about. But it's just the spec doesn't name them in that way, and the exam board, in kind of feedback from the exams, has asked that teachers teach it in a different, not a different way,
No.
but that students use a different vocabulary, and it's not the end of the world, but it would be better to change. Instead of saying fundamentalist socialist, you should say revolutionary socialists, Instead of revisionist, you could say, or should say, social democracy. And that links to what Duncan was saying about the confusion with Beatrice Webb, because she's not a social democrat. And the third way is the same language.
Yeah. I mean, it depends. Those are the strands. So when we're talking about the agreement or disagreement with the strands, it's revolutionary, social democrat, and third way. If you're talking about their attitude towards capitalism, you could mention the fact that some socialists, who you might term fundamentalists, think that you should get rid of capitalism altogether, whereas others think you can reform it. But always bring it back to those three strands. So you can. It's not that this, this is right. This is, and it's in some of the textbooks, and it's, it's a. There's these different ways of talking about, like, revolutionary versus evolutionary, or fundamentalist versus revisionist, whatever. They exist, and we don't want to ignore them. And democratic socialism, don't know why that wasn't included as a strand, really, but it wasn't. But yeah, focus on the extent of agreement between those three named strands: revolutionary, social democrat, and third way. That should be your focus. Okay. How would you write an answer for a general question on united or disunited for the different ideologies? I think in some ways that's the nicest question, isn't it? If that one comes up, if you get one that isn't specifying to what extent they're united about human nature, or about the state, or about society, or about a particular concept, but just in general, then, I mean, the problem then is, like, narrowing it down, isn't it? Selecting what you're going to talk about. I'd probably go pick out a couple out of state, human nature, society. Like, do a paragraph on human nature, paragraph on the state, maybe, or something along those lines, or the economy. Well, it's a nice question. If you get one of those, I'd see that as a win.
I would do the exact same. Actually, I'd choose human nature and the state, and then just talk about the extent of agreement or disagreement within them.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Sorry, I've realised what I'm doing. Trying to work out what. Okay. All right. Okay, this one's an interesting one from Patrick. How could you structure a question like? So there's a general question about structure, which I'll come back to in a minute. So this one's not so much about the structure. We'll come back to structure in a moment, but this one's more about what could the counter arguments be, or the arguments and counter arguments be. To what extent do conservatives have a common view of human nature? To what extent do they have a common view of human nature? Sorry, there's someone at my door. Just ignore that. Ciara, you answer that for a second while I just...
Okay, yes. So yeah, I think within that, because there is always a counterpoint, because the question is to what extent, right? So you can think about the aspects of human nature that there are agreements and disagreements on, and kind of categorize it that way. So you could talk maybe just about human nature in the first paragraph, or first main body paragraph, and say, okay, well, what is the elements that they agree and disagree on? So maybe more positive view of human nature, and a more with new right conservatives, and a more negative view in earlier conservatism. And then your second paragraph could be about how human nature informs their perspective on the state. So because of their view on human nature, humans should be as regulated as possible, which is what traditional conservatives argue, whereas there is more disagreement with more modern conservatives who argue for less regulation in the economy, or something like that. So just thinking about, in each paragraph, you should be considering the counterpoint. It should be there present in each paragraph. But I think the easiest way to do that is by structuring it so that you've got a criteria where you're measuring that extent of agreement and disagreement for each.
Okay, that was there was a general question about structure as well. Just on that last one, So on this general structure, there are two lines of thought out there, and they're both Edexcel have made it clear that both can do well. So there's the one that Ciara was saying, and to be honest, it's the way I'd go as well. Go with criteria and have the extent to which they agree versus the extent to which they disagree on that point, with a mini conclusion. There has been a bit of a trend towards, like, say, 2 disagrees and an agree, or sorry, probably the other way around, agree and 2 disagrees in terms of paragraphs. And Edexcel said they're happy with that. I think the issue with that one, and you got to be slightly careful, is how you reach your judgment, and how you reach your judgment in your paragraphs as well as leading up, because obviously it's about the extent to which they agree. So if you've done a paragraph which is all about how they agree, yeah, then how do you in that paragraph say, therefore they agree a bit or they don't agree, because you haven't said anything about how they disagree. So you just have to be a little bit careful about how you reach your judgments. But absolutely, yeah, there's
because actually I
way.
used to teach it like that
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
as a teacher you want all of the bases to be covered, so you're trying to basically say best case scenario.
Yeah.
And then I started to realize that a lot of my students were struggling with time, so
Yeah.
by telling them to separate it, it ended up disadvantaging them because they would run out of time. So
Yeah.
then I switched it to just basically trying to make sure that every paragraph has an argument and a counter in it.
Yeah.
And
But both
they're really
yeah.
both are right.
But, yeah. So don't if you do the way you've been taught, and got your feedback from your teachers. But yeah, your judgment, that's the important thing. Your judgment is extent of agreement. Okay, so in the other ones, you're evaluating the view, aren't you? All the other questions, you're evaluating the view. So you need to come down firmly on one side or the other. This one, it might be that they agree to a large extent. They disagree to a large extent. There's some agreement. There's a small extent of agreement. You're making that more nuanced judgment on this. Yeah, and I think that's the most important thing, more than the exact sort of paragraph structure. But you still need to indicate your judgment and revisit it throughout. Yeah, it's still an essay in the same way. Yeah, and you need to be able to reach that conclusion that it's the extent of agreement or disagreement. Obviously, the wording of the question has varied slightly from time to time, but that is still basically what they're asking: the extent to which they agree or disagree. Okay, I'm just having a quick look. I think the questions are sort of gone slightly away from the from what we're talking about, which is fine because it's about time we signed off, really. So with that in mind, thank you very much for all your questions. Lots of sensible questions, and you could tell from when you were sort of answering each other's questions in the chat window that lots of you have got this. You know what you're doing. I was just seeing another question. Just put, how would you structure a source and non-source? Just quickly do that. Structure them exactly the same.
Yeah, and I just think the source.
I would. Yeah, the essay would.
Yeah, they are the same. And I think the only real difference between each of them is that the source question provides you with your argument. So the source question is also almost like a literacy question in a sense, because it's seeing, are you able to read the source and pull out arguments and counter arguments, and then you do what you do with a normal essay. So just taking that time, I always like to kind of have a little table saying agree, disagree. Then once I've got that, I just kind of think, okay, well, what's the comparison? Which of these are good paired arguments, and going from there. So the source is good. It's not. It's there to help, I think, not hinder.
Yeah, maybe highlight the arguments for and against the issue with different coloured highlighter pens so you can see them. But yeah, it's basically the same thing. But with the source question, they've given you the arguments, and with the other one, you have to think of the arguments yourself. But in every other respect, it's the same, isn't it? Yeah, the essay will look the same, but make sure you keep referring to the source. Yeah. Say I'm using the source. It might be really obvious.
Yeah, that's actually so important. Like just saying the source says helps because it's part of the mark, isn't it? The mark scheme. If you're helping an examiner, it's good.
Yeah, I was going to say it's quite easy to miss that you're using the source. You might not be using the source in exactly the way the examiner's expecting you to use the source, but if you are using the source, then you are using the source. So just say, as said in the source, or put a little quote in it, or something like that, quotation marks, or source in brackets afterwards. Yeah, all of that. Okay. I think we are done. Thank you very much, Ciara, and thanks everybody else. Good luck for tomorrow. Chill out. Don't sort of stress yourselves too much tonight. Make sure you get a good night's sleep, and I hope you have and I hope it's a nice fair paper and you come out feeling happy with it. Okay. Cheers, guys. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ciara.
Thank you. Bye-bye.